The sources were British art, artists like Graham Sutherland. I decided I can't show you all this because it takes too long, but very, very important was Hans Hofmann, whose role in terms of all of Painters 11, I think hasn't been sufficiently acknowledged. We know that it's been well known for a long time that Alexander Luke and Jock MacDonald and William Ronald all went to study for a time with Hans Hofmann, but through them, through Alexander Luke's lecture notes on Hofmann's teachings and through the publication of Hofmann's work, and through the style, the color change in Luke and particularly Alexander Luke, the Toronto artists got a real flavor of Hofmann. Also important, of course, were Willem de Kooning and Jackson Pollock. I'm just throwing these in just to remind you. And I did want to put in that top Pollock image, which is titled She-Wolf. It's an early Pollock of 1943, when there is still figurative and mythical references in his work, because I wanted to underline that the New York abstract expressionists, as well as the British, all thought of themselves as having subject matter in their work. In fact, they got together at one point as a group called the Subjects of the Painter. And it was really the formalist criticism of the 1950s and 60s that elided that subject matter. But this was important for the Toronto artists too. They also had to find their subject matter. And for Town, that subject matter would be the environment of Toronto. He created a kind of myth of Toronto's essence as a city full of trees and ravines where machines and industry, the motor car, factories intermingled and penetrated the forest that had been there before. So a painting like this titled Mechanical Forest Sound of 1953, done before the group had started exhibiting together, you can see that there's sort of references that may make you think of a buzzsaw operating or maybe a buzzsaw being a musical instrument. And we'll see throughout his imagery that Toronto is one of these coded references in his work. His development during Painters 11 showed him creating this very calligraphic style of muscular gestures. Painters 11 was still working on a smaller scale than the New York artists, but Town quickly filled his whole canvases and also upped the scale and size of his work. I'm showing you here another painting with local references. It's called, these two paintings are, and I'm showing you the little tiny picture of them in installation so you can see how huge they are. They are 8 foot tall. They're called Deadboat Pond, and this refers to a pond in the Toronto Islands where Town and Yarwood would go with Tom Hodgson for weekends. So at this time, Town espoused wholeheartedly Harold Rosenberg's definition of art. In a widely circulated article, The American Action Painters of December 1952 in Art News, Rosenberg described the painter's canvas as an arena for action and as an act inseparable from the biography of the artist. Rosenberg continued writing throughout the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s, and Town continued to read his writings. And, you know, I have to say to you that during that time, I was a total Clement Greenberg apostle. And so I never read Harold Rosenberg, and it's with great fascination that I have been reading him in the last 2 years, and I discovered that actually he's been heralded as a prophet of postmodernism. So it all goes together. Town was extremely faithful to Rosenberg's ideas, which were very open and Catholic. Unlike Greenberg, he did not establish a kind of genealogy and linear development. Rosenberg believed in pluralism, that there were many types of art, that modern art was full of ruptures, that is, that there weren't these neat continuities, and that every kind of art had to be looked at on its own terms, something, criteria by which Harold Town could justify his own work, although no one in Toronto saw it that way as he moved away from the approved types of work. I also briefly have to mention the importance of printmaking, because this was something that was extremely important to Town's international success. He developed a form of monoprint. He obtained a lithographic stone from Oscar Cahen, and we've recently, through the kindness of Jolene Grove and access to the Cahen estate, I've been able to discover that Cahen and Town worked very closely side by side for a while at this time, doing these single prints that are called reverse drawings, where you put the paper down on the inked stone and then you draw on the back of the paper with a sharp implement. So Town actually used this in his commercial art to design an item like here, the cover of the Imperial Oil Review, and he explored it more and more extensively in his printmaking, putting on, pulling a print time and time again, but it always was only a single work, because you're not making an edition here, using stencils, all kinds of found materials, bits of previous prints, to create these amazingly layered surfaces. And these prints had an enormous international success. He sent them to all the big international shows at Sao Paulo, Ljubljana, and elsewhere, and won prizes. So, this was something for Toronto, that here was this Toronto artist who was having this great success. Here, just quickly, an image of what it was like when he was working in his little attic studio on Rathnalley Avenue with all these half-done pulls around him and all the debris on his desk, which he was using to move around. Now, the other great claim to preeminence that Town managed to have under his belt was that in 1958 he got the commission to paint a gigantic mural for the St. Lawrence Seaway, the Ontario Hydro generating station on the St. Lawrence Seaway. And it was absolutely remarkable that in 1958 a young abstract artist should be doing this. I'm sure you are all familiar with murals in Toronto like the O'Keefe Centre or York Wilson's murals in the Imperial Oil Building, which combined certain abstract stylizations with a much more recognizable figurative style. So that was the opposition against which Town won this competition. And you can see that it's enormous. I'm showing you a little detail from it here, and one of the press photographs of Town leaping and prancing in order to do the drawing on this enormous canvas. Town becomes a kind of reincarnated Jackson Pollock for Toronto by making this work. And so this, again, truly propelled him into Toronto consciousness as a force to be reckoned with. Now, please, I can't tell you everything in this one lecture, so I have to skip ahead, but what I really want to emphasize today is that in this process of printmaking, and also the collage that he made at the same, so the Museum of Modern Art purchased 4 of these prints in 1961. Alfred Barr visited Toronto, right? So again, another feather in the cap of Toronto and Town. So at the same time as the collage, Town began to make collage. These mostly were on a scale of 4 foot by 4 foot, so large. And here again, just as in the prints, he was moving around compositional elements and composing with units rather than doing his calligraphic brushwork. So both the prints and the collage helped to move him beyond simply gestural painting. This was very important, and it also enabled him to pay attention to other aspects of the environment that fascinated him. You know, the modern affluent society with all its throwaway elements, and the modern city with all its amenities. You're seeing here a homage to C.T. Corelli, the first great curator of the Royal Ontario Museum. And Town was absolutely enthralled with the Royal Ontario Museum. He claimed that it taught him more than his years of study at the Ontario College of Art. And he spent hours and hours studying the Asian, Egyptian, Assyrian, and other artworks there. So, and you can see in a collage to the right that he refers to various global art forms in these collages. Of course, this was also a period of huge international interest in collage. Robert Motherwell's book on the Dada painters and poets came out. The work of people like Schwitters and the Dadaists was becoming well known through publications. So Town is part of that wave that was led by people in the USA like Robert Rauschenberg, of working with elements of the real world in the form of collage. But what I want to emphasize is that at this time, another element that enters Town's work is that his work becomes art about other art. And you see that here in this reference to Chinese art. Town's work now is beginning to move away from abstract expressionism. It's still spontaneous and intuitive in many respects, but now he brings his elements together in much more deliberate and formal compositions. Around 1960, he was doing large, emblematic, heroic paintings. And this painting here, which is titled Inscape, Outscape, I skipped over it, I was delighted to find that it's in the McMaster painting collection. This is one of the places where, you know, I felt, looking at Town's work, what is this all about? It needs to be decoded. So this, I decided, is a painting about baseball. There's a baseball diamond, there's a pitcher, there's probably a scoreboard there, and we know that Town had done drawings of various, he was very much a sports fan. He did drawings of sports people of various kinds. You can read this painting as that, but at the same time, it's also a comment on Mondrian, because in this painting, you can see that he's introduced an internal frame and these little squares that dot around, which are a kind of homage to Broadway boogie woogie. And one of the things that Town, actually, when you look at the paintings in this room, you're going to have to look for where he tips his hat to Vincent van Gogh. So Town is continually referring to contemporary artists in a moment, but to the artists of the past that he admires, taking on their work and getting into arguments with it. As in this collage, The Death of Mondrian, 1961, where he's taken a blowtorch to a rectangular collage that is somewhat like one of the early rectangular works of Mondrian. So in these works of the 1960s, we see a continual layering, integration of very diverse elements, but still into a very painterly mode, or into modes that were recognized at the time. Town was a tremendous object of interest in the press. You'll find this well covered in Iris Knowles' books and also in the e-monograph. His exhibitions in Toronto, his gallery shows were great social events. People queued up to the openings in order to secure the paintings they wanted. At one 1961 show, the rumor was that everything had sold out by the first night. And he was covered by the press. So this period, which Robert Fulford has characterized as Town's magnificent decade was still a period in which he fitted the artistic criteria of the time. Now, I have to move on from the rise to the fall of Harold Town. After the late 60s, Town remained a figure on the scene, but his presence after the end of Painters 11 was as one of many artists in a proliferating art scene of new trends. You know, when I work on Harold Town, I get so sort of sucked into him, and then I look through copies of Arts Canada in the 1950s and 60s, and there were so many other artists. I mean, it really was an exploding scene. So he wasn't the only one. And revolutions continued to happen. There was post-painterly abstraction, a current championed by Clement Greenberg, who launched Jack Bush and the Prairie Painters into an international arena. There was conceptual art with Michael Snow and Joyce Wieland, linking up with the conceptual art currents in New York. There was pop art, which attracted some Toronto artists. There was the regional realism of Jack Chambers, the regionalism of Greg Curnow, and each of these found support from local curators and critics who fostered Canadian work rooted within the international critical framework. And Town was certainly aware of critical trends, but he disagreed fundamentally with the dominant critic Clement Greenberg, whom he regarded as prescriptive and reductive. In fact, in his paintings, Town was doing something new, which I believe was not acknowledged or analyzed at the time because there wasn't a critical language to spot it. So, you know, within modernism, because of this rapid development, there was always this anxiety of what the next move was going to be. This was an anxiety that plagued artists. You know, you couldn't just latch on to what was happening at the moment. You had to find the next move that would make you the next important thing. And this was, I think, a very significant next move, which was not analyzed in critical terms at the time. Harold Town's Tyranny of the Corner paintings. In these paintings, Town actually shared a lot with many other contemporaries. He set himself specific limits. He deliberately selected constraints, and he worked in series where he explored these constraints, as did many artists at the time who were moving away from abstract expressionism and working programmatically. The process artists, the land artists, who all performed transactions with non-traditional materials. The systemic painting movement of the 1960s that investigated specific formats. So Town was not alone, but he flew under the radar because there was no critic in Toronto who had the sort of critical training to analyze what he was doing. Town's work raised different issues from most other artists. He was concerned with pictorial structure, but not within the framework of a Greenbergian logic that demanded the elimination of everything not essential to the medium itself. His pictorial structures opened up to let in different visual languages from his contemporary environment, from design and architecture, from art history, in order to confront them and collide them. His use of the term set in many of these titles, here Tyranny of the Corner Sachet Set, makes clear reference to music, to the orchestration of elements, to jazz where you get a series of pieces played in a sequence between intervals. And Town himself orchestrates the elements of his pictures. He orchestrates heterogeneous elements, much like today's practice of plunderphonics. His paintings sprang from this continuing fascination with his environment, the growing metropolitan city of Toronto, its signage and advertising, its collision of cultures and languages. And for several years at this time, from the mid-60s on, he was writing a regular column for Toronto Life, commenting on the evolution of the city, on sport as part of popular culture, on jazz and on film. He was kind of precursor of cultural studies, if you like. These paintings of the Tyranny and Set series clarify themes that would persist in his painting. A desire that we now see to disturb the utopian purity of modernism, to complicate it, to emphasize conflict and contradictions. At the same time, he continued to devote a lot of time to graphic work. In 1964, he produced a series called The Enigmas, which were a kind of nightmarish revisiting of Goya's satirical etchings, but targeting various phenomena that he disliked around him in Toronto. Doctors, maybe marital relations, I don't know. Hypocrisy, all kind, money, the cult of money. I'm only showing you one, but they're published, you can find them. And at the same time, he also chronicled the celebrities that were coming through the media, through the city. And he worked together with writers at the time. You see here a cover design for Leonard Cohen's Beautiful Losers. So an iconography parallel to the sort of thing that Andy Warhol was doing, but in a very different way. In a way, this work glances sideways at a whole host of contemporary movements, also glancing at pop art. So he did, in the later 60s, a series that he titled The No Ops, because a critic had written that there was no optical art in Canada, so, okay, his works weren't optical art, where you can see, again, that he complicates the kind of compositions that op artists were doing, and really and truly does extraordinary things to them with his irresistible virtuosity. In these paintings, he was able to orchestrate elements that pointed to conflict, to sort of dark shadows behind attractive jazzy designs and so on. This is another series called The Silent Lights, which were inspired by an event when his Christmas tree covered in silver balls was knocked over, and a lot of the balls were broken, and he was fascinated by the visual effect of the reflections of lights and of decorations in these broken glass fragments. So, and nowadays with computer design, these sorts of images seem slightly familiar, but Town did all this by hand. It was incredibly laborious. And if you read things that he said to journalists that were reported at the time, you will discover that in a painting such as this, he was taking on Vermeer. I thought to myself, how can I read this review where he talks about Vermeer, being the person that he's looking at and feels he has to learn from. And I thought, what can that possibly mean? And then I realized, well, yes, he's working with perspective, he's working with pattern, he's working with order, and you can see that for him the two things are related. Another amazing and monumental series, moving on into the later 1970s, are the snaps. These are huge, monumental paintings that are done, again, by an amazingly laborious technique where he sets up a snap line in front of the canvas, loads it with paint, and snaps it to deposit the paint on the canvas. Now, if you're looking in a Greenbergian way at a way of creating formal innovation, this is, in a sense, a new move that looks at ways in which the medium has been used in the past, because artists who were working in fresco would use snap lines and so on. But Town creates amazingly rich color effects with this. And then when you look at it, you notice these strange little elements that float in the picture that are amazingly postmodern. These completely divergent little elements that sort of say, science fiction, Walt Disney, what is this? The viral invasion of another language into the work. I feel that these works, like paintings by Mondrian, you can't just put them into your drawing room. They will dominate whatever environment they come into, and you have to modify your decor to showcase them. Paintings like this would look absolutely fabulous in a big, brutal, modern loft. And I'm hoping that a lot of them will fly there. Now, at the same time, you know, he goes on making graphic work, and I'm overrunning, so I'm going to pass through it quickly and just show you a couple more of the late series, because, you know, when Town developed a format like this, he would work it through with scores or sometimes even hundreds of variations. Here you're looking at one of the series he did on paper, works on paper, that come in increasingly large scale, the veil variations, where he took a little drawing by his friend Florence Vail. So this is a drawing by a woman artist. You know, I have to say that the gender implications of Town's work did trouble me. And so I thought about this, and you know, it was a little mollifying to think that he'd taken a woman's image as the starting point for continuing the tradition of the female nude, which is such a masculinist genre. But the more I looked at these works, and also at a sort of counterpart series called The Gods, which are male warrior figures, sort of Greek warriors, and other works like The Muscle Men, the more I realized that Town is working with gender imagery in a highly ironic way. You know, he can't divorce himself from his fantasy and desires of the past to have images of virile men and buxom women, but he realizes that this is a world of images, and he uses images always in inverted commas and very clearly as images about images. So that's a kind of slight apology for the content here from a feminist. The interesting thing in the veil variations, Florence Vail did include a male figure whom you see horizontal on the right-hand bottom of her sketch at the top. And Harold Town shifts this male figure around and changes this male figure. So in his pastel, you see the male figure at the bottom left as a bearded male head with closed eyes, this kind of dream voyeur of the female nude in the picture. Nice. Another series that I can only just nod to is the toy horses, which I know people in Toronto did love, even though by that time the critics weren't really praising him so much anymore. But where again he creates extraordinarily surrealist, uncanny and eerie images. And The Stages, which is a series in the 1980s where he created abstract designs, again with a collage process, painting on sheets of card and then cutting it out into ziggurat compositions, always focused around a center, which he thinks of as a kind of stage where something is happening. And then around it, there's this kind of Colosseum-like auditorium. But you see again the corners, you know, that's sort of referencing his own past composition. There's this reference to the corners and to effects of space and optical illusion and so on. In 1987, he was commissioned by Garth Drabinsky to do a couple of enormous murals for a cinema in Los Angeles. That cinema and its artwork and the other Drabinsky cinemas and their artwork have since melted into the mists of time. But I'm very glad to tell you that one of these murals has been obtained for the TIFF Lightbox. So one of these days we'll be able to see it in a very appropriate setting. Look at how he uses the compositional structure that he developed in Stages to talk about the psychological effects of cinema, the way you're drawn in, the way the imagery comes out to you, the way you're walking through a series of spaces when you enter the cinema. Luckily, this is an image before the popcorn stalls and the wonderland that now graces our cineplexes. So, last of all then, this monumental series of paintings, of which the Spengler painting is one. These were part of a large show that Town put on at the Waddington Galleries in 1980. And there's a painting about Marshall McLuhan. There are paintings about the Marx Brothers, about various other folk heroes that Town culled out of the press. And in this painting, I can't talk about it at great length, but I want to say that, of course, I had to go off and read Spengler in order to do this. And I found that Spengler is a really good read today. I find him a kind of precursor of world art history, the sort of world art history that we teach in introductory art history courses. His book, The Decline of the West, is actually an outline history of a number of different great world cultures, which he looks at with equal respect and interest. He did prophesy the downfall of Western culture in the age of the masses. He felt that totalitarianism was the inevitable end to which that was leading. Very prophetic words. And actually his book was very much admired by the Nazis, who thought that he was foretelling Hitler. Spengler did not intend it that way, and he wrote another book denouncing Hitler and was promptly censored and banned under the Nazis. But it's interesting that Town, there's also a lot of invective in the book against the commercialization of art and the way in which art functions in contemporary society. And Town must have felt a real ring of recognition with that. So he presents here quite an ironic image of Spengler. He is elevating him as a hero, but notice how he floats above the everyday world of the kitchen table. His head is haloed in an almost swastika set of light rays. And, I think Town might have seen himself with his omnivorous interests as also being somewhat of a Spengler-like figure. Town's turn to monumental figure art predated the arrival in Toronto of the exhibition, The European Iceberg, which brought to Torontonians evidence of the international upsurge of figurative work, conceptually grounded and based on highly polemical subject matter in many cases by European artists. Too late for people to make any connection with Town. John Bentley Mays, reviewing that show by Town, called it a garish garage sale of the contents of Harold Town's mind. So tonight we have seen only the tip of Harold Town's iceberg. And I want to leave you with a concluding question. Can Toronto now be ready to accept that a highly original and amazingly tuned in artist was at work here from the 1970s on? And is Toronto ready to explore more deeply the treasures that he has left? Town's inspiration was himself and his world. He worked under the aegis of Western art's great masters, but opened up to the global village of his time. He mediated his own place, which was Toronto, and which for him was good enough.